Constructive dismissal is one of the most misunderstood topics in employment law in Nigeria. And today, I want to break it down for you so you can understand it properly. What does constructive dismissal mean? Constructive dismissal is a situation where your employer fundamentally breaches your contract of employment in such a way that you have no other choice but to resign your employment with immediate effect. So, normally, under a contract of employment, an employer has the right to terminate your employment or to dismiss you for gross misconduct. So, in that sort of situation, your employer terminates your employment directly with an action that you can trace directly towards him, and there's no debate about him not wanting you with him anymore. But in the case of constructive dismissal, the employer does certain things that amounts to a breach of your contract, but they don't tell you to leave or they don't terminate your employment or sack you directly. So if this sort of situation happens, it becomes constructive dismissal because you don't accept it, you can't tolerate it, and based on that, you've gotten the message and you decided to leave the employment with immediate effect. However, what we've seen in practice is that employees usually assume that their situation amounts to constructive dismissal when that is not the case. So, what are the examples of valid cases of constructive dismissal? For example, you work with someone, and normally, before you gain access to your offices, they give you an ID card that you use to gain entry. You have access to the office system. If all of a sudden they log you out, you cannot access the building, you cannot access the portal of the company, you cannot access your system. You've tried to find out what the problem is. Nobody is talking to you, and you can't even get to do your job. And when you get to the security, they tell you can't come in, that they got instruction from above. That's an example of constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal can also be when they say, I don't want to see you anymore. For example, there was a case I once did that involved discrimination on health ground. The employee was compelled to carry out certain medical tests, and when the results came out, they just mentioned that, oh, we don't want to see you, without terminating his employment. So he had to leave, and the court held that that was constructive dismissal. However, there was a recent article I wrote where a lady was owed 5 months' salary. She was the COO of an organization, and she was owed 5 months' salary. And when she resigned, she went to court and claimed that a case was a case of constructive dismissal because by owing her salary, she had to leave the employment. But the court held that no, a case doesn't fall under constructive dismissal because she condoned that action. She waited for 5 months. So the court held that having waited for 5 months, it means you have agreed to what your employer has done and you cannot rely on constructive dismissal. So what this case suggests is that when your employer owes you salary, it can amount to constructive dismissal, but you must not tolerate it for an extended period of time. If your employer owes you salary and you tolerate it for an extended period of time, you can't resign again and say you have been constructively dismissed because you've condoned it. And another important factor in understanding constructive dismissal is that where the employer has carried out certain actions that amounts to a fundamental breach, not just a normal breach, then you resign. And when you resign, in your letter of resignation, you must state that you are resigning because of that action that constitutes constructive dismissal. So, in summary, constructive dismissal is when your employer fundamentally breaches your agreement in such a way that you find it impossible to continue to work for that employer. If your employer commits certain minor breaches, that will not be regarded as constructive dismissal. And the rule in constructive dismissal is you must not condone it for an extended period. Once it happens and you cannot take it and you cannot perform your job, then you must leave the employment and give your resignation based on that. Another example, final example before we go, the contract of employment says that you are going to be working in Lagos, and it's a 3-day physical job and 2-day remote work. And it doesn't say anything about your employer transferring you somewhere else, or you can work from another place, or they can transfer you anywhere. And if after 2 weeks or after some months of working, they suddenly say that you have to go and start working with a sister company in Maiduguri, If it's something that was not in your contract of employment and you are not willing to accept it, that can be regarded as a case of constructive dismissal because it amounts to a fundamental breach of your contract of employment since the contract of employment has said you are going to be working in Lagos. However, if your contract says that you can be transferred to any of the branches of the company and they transfer you there, that will not be a case of constructive dismissal. So constructive dismissal is not something we just assume or just rush into and say, oh, my employer has done this, so it amounts to constructive dismissal. No, it's something that must be reviewed thoroughly and you must make sure that you have met all the criteria for constructive dismissal. Thank you very much.